To AP Lang. Today we're going to be breaking down the rhetorical analysis essay using the 2010 prompt. So in an earlier video, I believe about 2 or 3 weeks ago, we made a video discussing the rhetorical analysis essay and we broke it down completely. We went through every single way you would earn the 6 points and all of that. Today we're going to be using a specific essay. This is the 2010 rhetorical analysis essay. And we're going to be giving an example. This is actually my example of this essay. This is also the first ever rhetorical analysis essay that I wrote last year. I believe this would be a 4 out of 6 on the AP. And the reason why I'm showing you a 4 instead of beginning with a 6 is because I think the majority of the people who are going to be taking the exam, number one, are not going to be getting a 6, let alone a 5. So to see where you should be starting at, especially with the fact that I'm guessing the majority of the people watching this channel are taking AP Lang currently, this is a good way to show where you could be starting at, maybe showing a 4 to show where you could be beginning to show how you could grow throughout the video. So eventually in a few months, I can show you what a 6 would look like for one of the more recent prompts. So in this essay, this was about Benjamin Banneker, the son of former slaves who was a plethora of different professions. And in 1791, he wrote to Thomas Jefferson, who also wrote the Declaration of Independence, obviously, and about how he used rhetorical strategies to argue against slavery. So I'm going to, in a second, let you read it. There's 2 slides, I believe, of the full document, so you could just pause the video to read it all. And then we're going to break down my essay, why it only got a 4, what it did to get the 4, because the 4 is still very solid on an essay. Obviously, I do think many people who are watching this video are probably going to be aiming for higher than a 4, but yes. So you can pause here if you want to read this. I do suggest reading it if you're going to be watching the video. So you can pause this part now, and then here is the second half of it as well. So it's 2 slides of the reading. It's a little bit long, but on the AP, it's really not that long of a reading. So obviously for the rhetorical analysis essay, this is an essay based on a smaller document. It's about what rhetorical strategies they use in the document to gain points. So what I did basically in my essay is I broke down 2 different strategies that he used to sway Jefferson. So let's look at my introduction. So I'm not going to read my whole essay aloud because that's just a lot. So you can pause it to do that. However, I'm going to read certain pieces of it aloud. So here is the 2 pieces that I want to highlight, but we're first going to talk about the non-highlighted portion. So non-highlighted portion is what many people call like the contextualization or the lead up to your essay. So here I am framing what's going on at the time. I'm explaining that following the American Revolution, the United States was in a position of uncertainty. They were trying to figure out how to solve certain problems like slavery, and that led to Benjamin Banneker writing his letter. So my thesis, which is in yellow, is in his letter, he outlined his grievances with the current system of slavery and why it should be abolished, mainly due to his past experiences and beliefs on the hard system. So that's a very simple thesis. My thesis is he did not like slavery because of his past experiences and beliefs about it, and he wanted it to be abolished. Very fine thesis. However, then I build upon it in a sentence saying he achieves this by using pathos, ethos, and logos to support his argument, as well as appealing to Jefferson, the audience, by using his own written text against him. So there I explained the rhetorical strategies that I'm going to be going into during my essay, with one of them being how he uses pathos, ethos, and logos. That's in my first paragraph. And the second one, you're talking about how he uses audience. So this is the first thing I'd say is a little bit different than many rhetorical analysis essays are going to be. This is the way I did mine. However, this was, of course, my first rhetorical analysis essay, which is why I'm showing it to you. Obviously, this is definitely a more novice level essay, which is why I wanted to share it. I didn't want to show you what it definitely has to be. I want to show you where you should be starting. So one of the biggest issues is that I'm lumping pathos, ethos, and logos all into one paragraph and leaving audience on its own in the second. So pathos, ethos, and logos don't need to be grouped together. It honestly could be pathos in one paragraph and ethos in another, and that be it. As you remember from the last one, even you have to support your thesis with claims and evidence and commentary, obviously, but then you need to explain some rhetorical devices to support it. However, I have 4 rhetorical strategies that he uses. So why would I only be getting a 4? And that's partially, I'd say, because this could be a 5. I'd say it's a 4 or a 5. The reason why I'd say it's closer to the 4, though, is because some of the rhetorical devices don't always tie back as well. So we'll be going into that in a second, but very clearly there's a clear thesis, clear statement of rhetorical devices. This is why the thesis is going to get in 1. So here's the first body paragraph. You can pause it now to read it. However, I'm not going to take so much time out of the video to read it aloud. Here is the parts I want to highlight. So here are my 3 examples. So each one, the science pathos, green is logos, yellow is ethos. So in the pathos section, I get a quote, number one, but I pretty much explain in the pathos section, which is pretty much how like emotionally it's affecting him. And he tries to argue that the same rights that are onto other people should not just be a select population based on race. So this is a very, in my opinion, one of the stronger pieces. However, it's a little bit interesting because even though I have a good quote where I say how it ties into the emotional argument, it doesn't necessarily tie back to how it emotionally affects Jefferson. This is something I actually did mess up and I realized afterwards. Again, I should also preface I wrote this essay in about an hour, which is more time than you should take on the AP, but that should definitely change your viewpoint. However, back to what I was saying. One thing, even though I have a very good argument on how emotions and how pathos is affecting the argument, where it kind of struggles is the fact that it isn't necessarily saying how it affects Jefferson emotionally, which is what it kind of is saying, but not doing in a great way. The way it uses the quote is it's trying to say, oh, this quote is emotionally painting a picture of what all humans should desire and what Jefferson has. However, it doesn't necessarily show how Jefferson should feel as he's reading it. It's kind of showing emotionally how one thing's affecting Jefferson and somewhat tying it to the other one. However, it doesn't tie it together in a way that's strong enough so that it necessarily will get the point. Even though I have more than enough rhetorical devices mentioned in this essay, it doesn't tie it together so well that it shows the emotional effect. It kind of shows how emotions could play into the quote versus how it could play into Jefferson. However, it is not explained deeply enough. I probably need one or two more sentences in the cyan portion to get that one solid. For logos for logic, I'd say this is definitely one of the stronger ones. It states that it uses actually a pretty strong quote. I like this quote a lot. How Jefferson should be found guilty at the same time as the same with the same acts that he detested in others, pretty much showing how hypocritical it is. And again, this is the same way I was doing it before, which is a lot of the same issue, even though it's a little bit stronger, which is that it mentions how illogical and highlights the issues with it, especially with how the British rule over the colonies. However, it does produce some really great ideas. It doesn't explain them well. You'll notice at the start it says how he compares Jefferson to the British, and then it moves to how hypocritical it is. However, and then it ends with the illogical difference. It doesn't explain how it's illogical that how Jefferson is supporting the system that so greatly mirrors that of the British action. It kind of sets it up, but it doesn't go through with it, which is why that's going to also not fully get the point. For this last one, where it says this is for ethos, yes, this is for ethos, and he reminds Jefferson of the horrors of slavery's condition, which is something that Jefferson has seen and been, and ethos, which is obviously ethics, although it argues how unethical it is. I'll say this is actually probably the strongest of the three. However, even though I'll say this one actually is a pretty solid one, it says how following a revolution based on representation and equality, Banneker felt that it was owed to him, arguing that, well, through his usage of ethos. I'd say the yellow one's actually pretty solid. I think one more sentence could probably strengthen it a little bit better. However, what I think makes that one a lot stronger than the others is that in the others, I'd have like one or two sentences setting it up, then have the quote, and then only have like one or two sentences explaining the quote. In this one, I put the quote a lot earlier and then had more time to dive into the quote, which is why I feel like the ethos one is a little bit stronger than the pathos and logos ones, especially with the fact that the pathos and logos ones could have definitely gone the points. However, they were more ambitious. They had more ideas to tie together that it led to them kind of being more disjointed. The ethos one was more singular. It was more straightforward. So that one definitely got the full credit. So you'd be thinking, even though I made some mistakes, why is this still a 4? So obviously there's no sophistication at this point. We haven't seen any like sophisticated viewpoint. This is all pretty straightforward. And I didn't really go for sophistication this first essay. I didn't have any reason to. However, the reason why I'm not getting that fourth evidence point is because even though I'm producing some great evidence with some great commentary and some rhetorical devices, because in this paragraph only one of the three evidences is complete, it leads to me not getting the full credit. I'm going to show you the second paragraph in a second where it's going to do that a little bit better. And then that's why it's going to be getting a 3 out of 4 and not lower. The fact that I have enough evidence, enough commentary, and enough rhetorical devices mentioned is why I'm getting a 3 out of 4 in the evidence section. However, I could get a 4 if I was able to, in the pathos and logos sections, able to tie them together a little bit better and make the commentary and the analysis on it a little bit stronger so that I would then get a 4. Now let's move on to the conclusion. I'll just say doesn't really matter, but we'll go through it anyway. However, for the second body, you can pause it, read it. However, let's go into these highlighted sections. They're pretty much the way this one is, even though this entire paragraph is on the audience, which is Jefferson, I did use two different quotes to explain it. So this first quote, which is in cyan, which is "We hold these truths to be self-evident and that all men are created equal," is a very famous quote, obviously. And this is, in my opinion, a very strong piece of evidence. It's very simple. It says it's very popularized, and it was used in the Revolution because Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence, what Banneker was doing was using his own document against him. So he's saying if all men were created equally, why were they differentiated? He also uses the fact that humans are endowed by their creator certain unalienable rights. By the way, both of those quotes were quoted from the Declaration of Independence in his letter. So that also further shows the rhetoric. However, it shows that these unalienable rights were stripped from slaves. And this is also another very strong piece of evidence. This second paragraph is a lot stronger than the first because it really explains how the rhetorical idea of audience, because he knows it's Jefferson that's the audience, how he uses that own document that Jefferson knows so well against his idea of slavery. If all men are created equal, if they have unalienable rights, why are these rights being taken away? Why are they not treated equally? And here it explains how the common man was well, let me read this. And for a country that's meant to appeal to the common man, Banneker attempted to reveal how selective the idea of the common man was in his attempt to remove slavery. So again, this is a lot stronger of a paragraph than the first one. And both of these, if this was the way my entire essay was done, I would be getting a 4 on evidence. And I'd say these two very strong pieces of evidence definitely strengthen the weaknesses of the first part, and that probably averages out to that 3 out of 4 on evidence. The way I'd be getting a 4 on evidence is if my ethos and pathos arguments were a little bit stronger, a little bit more tied together. However, my audience argument was a lot stronger. Obviously, I didn't go for sophistication. There's a few ways you can get sophistication, but really it's just producing a more interesting argument, which I really didn't try to do here. As for the conclusion, you don't need a conclusion. I would suggest putting a conclusion because if your thesis statement fails, you can retry your thesis in your conclusion. My thesis was fine at first. However, your conclusion is always a nice safety net and always a nice way to type your essay, maybe help get some sophistication points, things like that. However, one thing I definitely say, looking back on this essay now, that I definitely could have done a lot better with that I didn't do initially, was that I feel like this essay, even though it does produce some great evidence, I used too many rhetorical devices and did not explain them well. For the fact that I have a full paragraph on audience, which is my better paragraph, compared to my full paragraph on 3 different rhetorical devices, is a very clear showing of why sometimes only 2 or 3 rhetorical devices will be necessary. If I just did my full paragraph on ethos and then a full one on audience, I feel like I could have gone on a 4 if I further dived into the idea of the ethos. I could have also done that for pathos and logos if I better explained those arguments. However, one thing I can definitely look back on this argument and say is that even though this is the rhetorical analysis essay, you don't need so many different pieces of rhetoric. You only need a few strong pieces of rhetoric to support your thesis. And your thesis needs to be stronger than your rhetorical analysis section of your essay. Although this essay is about rhetorical analysis, it's really document analysis with the support of rhetoric. Rhetoric is used as a piece of evidence. It's not used as a thesis. Your thesis isn't how he used rhetorical devices, even though it should relate to that. Your thesis is about the prompt and how rhetorical devices support it. It's not about how the rhetorical devices shape the essay. It's about how the rhetorical devices further the argument. And again, rhetorical devices are a piece of evidence. They're not a thesis at the end of the day. So I think this essay is definitely a solid 4. This is what some people are going to be striving for. This is a solid essay. Would definitely get a 4, possibly a 5, but I don't think it would ever get less than a 4. However, throughout the year, I'm going to be making more videos, and at some point, I'll make a video of a 6th essay that I made later in the year. But this was my first essay. A lot of first essays are going to be a lot worse than this, so some are going to be better. However, this is a good starting off point. This is good to see what mistakes one could make so that you guys can move forward. So yeah, that's going through the analyzing the rhetorical analysis essay of the 2010 prompt. Tell me if you like these types of videos. We have a ton of videos up on the channel. We'll be doing the Unit 3 breakdown soon enough. And yeah, that's all I have to say. This was How the AP Lang, and see you next time.